What would you do if the man you loved silently mortgaged your home to keep disaster away, only to watch that same disaster crash through your front door before he could stop it? The debt did not arrive like thunder. It came quietly first, in papers, signatures, late nights, and the exhausted silence of a man who thought he could carry everything alone. Jack believed he was protecting Tu Tien by hiding the truth, by smiling through fear, by turning their home itself into collateral just to buy them a little more time. But debt is a cruel enemy. It does not stay politely in the background. It enters the house. It leaves splinters on the floor. It teaches love what it means to kneel among ruins and still choose to remain. And by the time the violence had passed, Jack and Tu Tien would understand that survival was no longer about money alone. It was about whether two wounded people could rebuild trust, dignity, and hope from the wreckage of one terrible day. Before the shouting, before the smashed furniture, before tears soaked the floorboards, there had been only a dim room and a man running out of options. Jack sat alone under the weak yellow light, the kind of light that makes small rooms feel even smaller. The walls around him were familiar, but that evening they seemed to lean inward, as if even the house itself could feel the pressure building inside him. Numbers had followed him for days. Debt, interest, deadlines, payment dates. Each figure had become another knot pulling tighter around his breath. He had tried to calculate a path forward, then recalculated, then sat for long stretches, pretending there was still another solution hidden somewhere inside the math. But there was not. The burden had grown too large to ignore. He stared at the house deed in his hands for a long time before he moved. That single document felt heavier than any object in the room. It did not only represent land, walls, and a roof. It represented safety. The simple right to return home. The place where Tu Tien cooked, waited, laughed softly, and believed that whatever hardship life brought them, at least they still had a place to stand together. Jack knew that the moment he carried that deed to the bank, he would be placing all of that onto a dangerous scale. And yet, he went. The bank was bright, efficient, indifferent. Pens scratched over paper. Clerks spoke in the smooth tones of people for whom risk had already become routine. Jack signed where he was told to sign. The papers moved from one side of the desk to the other. Money was transferred. Everything happened with the cold efficiency of a formal process, and that almost made it worse. A home can be endangered in complete silence. A family's peace can be converted into numbers without anyone raising their voice. When Jack stepped back out onto the street, the city rushed on around him as if nothing in the world had changed. People crossed in front of him, motorbikes passed, vendors shouted, somewhere a phone rang. He stood still in the middle of all that movement with his gaze fixed on something far beyond the crowd. He had bought time, yes, but he had also done something irreversible. He had opened the door to a danger he could no longer fully control. Still, when he went home, he smiled. That was the part that hurt most. Not the signature, not even the debt itself. It was the smile, the forced steadiness, the quiet way he stepped back into the house and answered Tu Tien's questions as though his day had been ordinary. He did not want her to worry. He did not want her soft heart to start living in the same cage of calculation that had trapped him. So he carried the truth alone, and in doing so, he committed the mistake that so many loving people make. He mistook secrecy for protection. For a little while, the house still felt peaceful. That peace did not last. On the day everything broke open, Tu Tien was at home inside the ordinary comfort of familiar chores. There is something especially cruel about violence when it interrupts ordinary life. One moment, the house had only the sounds it always had, the movement of plates, the quiet shifting of chairs, the everyday rhythm that keeps a poor home feeling alive. Then the noise changed. The first sound was the door, then boots, then the crash. A group of men stormed inside, with the blunt force of people who had come not merely to threaten, but to mark territory with destruction. Their faces were hard, expressionless, emptied of all human softness by whatever logic Diep uses to turn men into instruments. Wooden sticks swung through the air. Chairs were struck first, then tables, then anything standing upright long enough to be broken. The sharp crack of splintering wood filled the room. Metal clanged. Bowls rolled across the floor. The kitchen, once the warm center of the house, was turned in seconds into a site of deliberate humiliation. Tu Tien froze only for a heartbeat. Then instinct took over. She ran toward them, panic already breaking her voice. Tears streamed down her face almost before she realized she was crying. She begged them to stop. She pleaded with the helpless sincerity of someone who still believes that if she says the right words, human cruelty might suddenly remember mercy. She reached for raised arms, tried to stand between the men and the furniture, tried to protect the space with her body as though love for a home might make her stronger than violence. It didn't. Her hands were too small. Her strength was no match for men driven by money and anger and the ugly righteousness of collection. Every time she tried to block them, she was pushed aside by the momentum of their destruction. Their sticks rose and fell again. Another chair shattered. Another tabletop split. The room echoed with blows until even the air seemed full of splinters. Fear took over completely then. Not only fear for the house, but the deeper fear that comes when safety itself is violated. Tu Tien's heart pounded so hard it seemed to shake through her chest. She cried openly now, not because she wanted pity, but because terror had nowhere else to go. Her home was being broken in front of her, and the person who should have been there to face the storm with her was still outside working, completely unaware that the nightmare had already entered the door. That helplessness became its own kind of wound. By the time the men left, the violence had already done what it came to do. It had not only broken furniture, it had broken the feeling that the house could shield the people inside it. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. Wood lay in jagged pieces across the floor. Chairs had collapsed inward like small bodies. A table leg leaned uselessly against the wall. Dust hung in the air with the bitter scent of fresh damage. And in the middle of it all, Tu Tien sank down among the wreckage and cried. When Jack came home and pushed open the door, he stopped as though something physical had struck him in the chest. The scene before him was not simply disorder, it was violation. Broken tables and chairs lay scattered across the floor like evidence of a crime committed against more than property. Household things were strewn everywhere. The room still seemed to hold the ghost of shouting and force. But what destroyed him was not the wreckage itself. It was the sight of Tu Tien kneeling there in the middle of it, trying with trembling hands to gather the broken pieces as though, if she moved quietly enough, she might reverse what had happened. For a moment, rage exploded through him so fiercely that his whole body went rigid. His fists clenched until the knuckles whitened, blood pounded in his ears. He wanted to storm back out, to find the men, to strike something, to turn humiliation into action. But then Tu Tien lifted her face, and he saw the redness around her eyes, the tears she had not been able to stop, the trembling still moving through her shoulders. And just like that, the anger burned out, leaving behind something heavier and far more painful. This was his doing. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but this destruction had followed the path he himself had opened. He had taken the deed to the bank. He had invited risk into the house. He had hidden it. And now the woman he loved had been made to kneel inside the consequences. Jack crossed the room slowly and dropped to his knees beside her. His hands shook as he reached for the broken pieces, helping her gather them one by one. It was such a small act, and yet there was something sacred in it. He did not begin with excuses. He did not defend himself. He did not tell her to stop crying. He simply knelt down into the wreckage with her, because love sometimes has no better language than shared labor after damage has already been done. Tu Tien's tears fell onto the back of his hand, and he felt each drop as though it were burning through his skin. In that moment, something in him hardened, not against her, not even against the men who had done this, but against the version of himself that had believed he could keep drifting from deadline to deadline and somehow still protect the people under his roof. He understood with painful clarity that he could not let her suffer like this again. Whatever happened next, whatever work it required, whatever pride it cost him, he had to become more than the man reacting to debt after it arrived. He had to become someone who could fight it before it reached her. Together, they cleaned the room in silence. The silence was not empty. It was crowded with shame, tenderness, grief, and the raw closeness of two people who had just been hurt by the same blow in different ways. Every plank of broken wood they lifted, every chair piece they moved aside, every shattered object they touched seemed to bind their pain together more tightly. This was no romantic scene. There were no beautiful words yet, only wounded devotion, kneeling on a damaged floor, trying to make the room feel livable again. And then, in the middle of that heaviness, Jack finally spoke. He took Tu Tien's hand gently and told her the news he had been carrying. The recent lumberyard deal, one he had almost not trusted himself to hope for, had brought in more profit than expected. As he explained it, something changed in his face. The darkness was still there, but now a thin line of light had entered it. The money, he said, was enough to repay a large part of what they owed, enough to begin pulling them back from the edge, enough to make a real decision instead of merely delaying disaster. Tu Tien listened through tears that had not yet fully dried. At first, she seemed almost too exhausted to process hope, but little by little, as Jack explained the numbers and what they would do with them, the expression on her face changed. The grief did not disappear. The humiliation of what had happened could not be erased so quickly. Yet inside the sorrow, something else appeared, a fragile joy, a hesitant relief, the first flicker of belief that maybe this day would not define the rest of their lives. For Jack, that moment mattered more than the money itself. It was not only about paying debt, it was about seeing light return to Tu Tien's face after he had watched it collapse under fear. The burden did not vanish, but it shifted. For the first time in many days, the future stopped looking like a tunnel with no opening. A small way forward had appeared, and with what remained after making the payment, Jack made one more decision. He went alone to the gold shop. It would have been easy to say the purchase was impractical, even foolish after everything that had happened. And perhaps from the outside, it was. But in Jack's heart, the necklace was not luxury. It was promise. It was apology transformed into something tangible. He chose a piece that was delicate, simple, and elegant, not loud enough to seem like display, but warm enough to carry meaning. He wanted to give Tu Tien something that would sit against her skin like a vow, that he would never again let her cry because he had hidden danger from her. When he returned and placed it around her neck, Tu Tien looked up in startled silence. The light caught the gold softly. For one suspended moment, all the shattered wood and all the violence of the day seemed to fall away. She lifted her hand to the necklace as though she could not quite believe it was real. Her eyes filled again, but not with fear now. This time, the emotion was gentler, deeper, almost disbelieving. The gift was small in material value compared with what they had nearly lost, but symbolically it was enormous. It told her she had not simply endured the day and been forgotten. He had seen her pain. He had carried it with him. He had returned with something that said, "I remember. I am still here. I am choosing you even through the wreckage." By nightfall, the house still bore the marks of damage, but warmth had returned. They sat at a simple dining table, not untouched by hardship, but reclaimed from it. Familiar dishes rested between them. Candlelight flickered against tired faces that had cried, cleaned, feared, hoped, and survived too much for one day. They spoke quietly then, not only about what had happened, but about what could still be rebuilt. Their conversation held no naive fantasy. They both knew peace like this could be fragile, but it was theirs, and that mattered. Jack looked at Tu Tien with a gratitude so deep it almost humbled him. She had stayed. She had not turned her fear into accusation. She had not walked away from a house that had just shown how vulnerable it truly was. And Tu Tien, touching the necklace lightly at her throat, smiled back with a tenderness made stronger by everything they had just endured. That meal became more than dinner. It became testimony to the fact that a home is not only walls, deeds, or furniture, it is also the people who remain after the chairs are broken, the hands that still clear the floor, the tears that still fall onto the hand reaching back, the quiet promise made in gold, the laugh that returns even after fear has passed through the room like a storm. In the end, debt does not only threaten property, it threatens dignity, peace, and the fragile illusion that love can stay untouched by the world's ugliness. Jack learned that secrecy born from love can still wound the person it is trying to protect. Tu Tien learned that courage is sometimes nothing more glamorous than kneeling in a ruined kitchen and still choosing to stay. And maybe that is the emotional truth this story leaves behind. Real love is not proven when life is gentle, but when splinters lie on the floor, shame burns in the chest, and two people still sit down together at the end of the night, determined to rebuild from whatever remains.